Hello and welcome to What's Next, Producer's Picks. For the past few months, the issue of asylum seekers and the mounting toll on community resources has dominated the headlines in Western New York. For this week's edition of Producer's Picks, we revisit the conversation we had with one of the 600 immigrants that ended up in a hotel in Cheektowaga and later the city of Amherst after having been bussed over from the city of New York. A city that is still trying to process the 125,000 immigrants that have arrived in the city since the spring. The gentleman we spoke to wished to keep his identity anonymous so as to not jeopardize his petition for asylum. For the purpose of this interview, we used the name Alberto. What you're about to hear is a translation of the conversation that was recorded shortly after Alberto and his wife's arrival to the area in June. Alberto, thank you so much for joining us on What's Next.
A good day to you, Lorenzo. I appreciate the opportunity, and I'd like to say thank you to the people of Buffalo for allowing us to share our story in the hopes of getting to know our experience a little bit more.
At least on my behalf, I'd like to welcome you here. This is now your city as well. We're known as the city of good neighbors, and I hope that your time here is filled with peace and that your process to residency is an easy one. I'd like to begin with how you got to this point. You were transported by bus from New York City, but how did you get to that point?
We got to New York City, Manhattan proper. Specifically, I had spent 7 months in the United States up until the point that we made our way to the city.
I was meaning to ask how the last few weeks have been, but in this case, your journey has taken months?
It's a bit complicated, really. You have a certain set of expectations when you enter this country, but then you're quickly met with the reality of the situation. I arrived here in December, and along with my wife, we've attempted to do everything by the book. But roughly 2 months ago, we were in a very complicated personal situation, and we had to seek out help, support, and housing from the many refugee support groups here.
Where were you before New York? What was your point of origin?
We are originally from Nicaragua. Back in Nicaragua, we had been supporting the fight for democracy in our home state since 2018, a place where democracy has been crumbling since.
I'd like to go into more detail about the state of affairs in your home country of Nicaragua, because, as I mentioned before our interview, my parents also fled an oppressive government in Cuba, and I know firsthand how much of a challenge it could be to emigrate under those conditions. But before delving into that, I'd like you to provide as much detail as you're comfortable to share about how you made it into this country.
Sincerely, Lorenzo, you're faced with a number of difficulties throughout that trajectory. For one, you encounter a great deal of xenophobia. From the moment you leave your country, you face discrimination, xenophobia, and most importantly, because you're separated from your family, you're susceptible to abductions, blackmails, extortion, arrest, police abuse, and if that wasn't enough, there's still the challenge of covering your everyday costs, including the need to have multiple forms of currency for each country that you cross into.
I assume that you traversed all this distance by foot? How many countries was that?
3 countries: Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico.
Merely by foot, or did you have to use automobiles or buses?
To tell you the truth, in our case, we had to literally flee out of Nicaragua. So yes, a portion had to be on foot, and then later on by bus. But the hardest part was getting through Mexico. It was very tough.
It's an extremely large country to traverse.
Yes, the hardest part of this journey was getting through Mexico.
You mentioned fleeing from dangers in your home country of Nicaragua. You had to leave family members back home, in particular your 2 daughters back home in Nicaragua, something I couldn't imagine I could do as a parent. It has to require dire circumstances in order to commit to that. Just how long was that portion of your journey from Nicaragua to the Mexico US border?
Our path from Nicaragua to the town of Matamoros, Mexico, took a total of 10 days. 10 days where we were faced with a number of complex obstacles.
Were they monetary issues? Problems with the government?
A little bit of everything. Upon getting to Guatemala, we were faced with financial obstacles. We practically left Nicaragua with just the clothes on our backs. In Guatemala, we faced abuse from law enforcement. They extorted us, stole our money. When we managed to finally enter Mexico, we practically had to pay for security. We didn't have the money, the knowledge, nor contacts to hire a coyote. We crossed by our own accord, which made things very complicated.
For those that may not know, Mexican coyotes are basically smugglers that are paid to get through all the roadblocks and obstacles that migrants face going through Mexico. Alberto, where would you say that you faced the biggest challenges? Was that in Mexico?
Yes, Mexico was it.
I understand that Mexico is currently facing a wide range of internal and political issues. Was that part of the problems that you faced traversing the country?
Yes, there's a lack of internal ethics, which is why we face the aforementioned abuse at the hands of the police. The same police would kidnap you. The same police will try to defraud you. The same police will extort you. The police are also a source of the discrimination, xenophobia, and human violations. These are all the things you have to overcome in order to get to the border.
You and your wife finally make it to the American border. How did that part of the journey go?
Very surreal. It's almost funny and sad at the same time. When we got to it, we hadn't realized that we had arrived to the Rio Grande. We crossed Mexico using Google Maps, and when we were near to the river, it was far too late at night to figure out a way to cross the river, specifically how to cross the waterway. Considering the area of Mexico and the part of the river that we found ourselves, we were very desperate. It was life and death for us. Much like how we left Nicaragua, it was very much like what we said then. Keep moving forward and don't look back.
That river is massive. There are parts of that river that span 300 feet or more. Did you swim across? Was there a low-lying area that you could walk over? How did you cross the Rio Grande?
Lorenzo, the truth is that when we reached the banks of the river, we realized that it was practically impossible to cross it. That's how dire the situation appeared. It was a violent, raging river. What we did as a life-saving measure was to tie empty jars and jugs to our waist in order to float. We swam and floated across that way. I'm a pretty tall individual, and not once did I reach the bottom of the floor of that river. It was impossible. Somehow we were able to cross it. We were very thirsty and dehydrated. The river would pull you back a lot, but we did it with those makeshift floating devices.
Wow. And how long did it take to traverse the river?
In that moment, things happened very quickly, but if I had to put an exact time to it, it was about half an hour to swim across.
So, you cross the Rio Grande and you touch what you might assume is American soil. Then what happened?
Just like when we got to the Rio Grande and didn't realize it, we didn't know we were in the United States when we crossed over. I didn't have a phone anymore with me. It didn't have reception out there. I didn't have the means to orient myself.
At what point did you lose your phone? Nowadays, you'll be hard pressed to find a paper map anywhere here. Google Maps was basically your only means of navigating out there, I assume.
I actually crossed the river with it, but it didn't make it. It was damaged by all the water, so we did not have it once we finished crossing.
And what do you find once you cross into the U.S. side?
We came through an area known as McAllen, Texas, and there were helicopters, ICE patrol cars, and agents. I sought them out and turned myself in so that I could declare political asylum.
Upon getting to Texas, how was the messaging and the guidance provided to you by ICE and Border Patrol once you were being processed? From Texas to New York City, where you eventually boarded the bus to get here, were you properly informed about your next steps?
When they detain you, they tell you about the period of time you get to claim asylum and continue the process. They also provide a phone with GPS, and that's also how you remain in contact with them.
Just to clarify, in regards to seeking asylum, is Nicaragua considered a United Nations refugee nation? Does it have that designation?
I don't believe so, but we currently meet the criteria here in the US and in Europe to claim asylum due to the conditions in our home country.
When I was told about your case, the thing that stood out was that you were from Nicaragua. A lot of the refugee cases we're hearing about here in the United States hail from Western Africa, Mexico, a number of them fleeing from the Maduro regime in Venezuela, Cuba.
I'd like to provide a figure for you.
Please do.
The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, has stated that what we are currently seeing in Nicaragua is the largest migration of people since the Cold War. It's more than 150,000 Nicaraguans that have fled due to the destruction of democracy and the injustices that protesters are facing in the country.
I have limited knowledge of the political situation in Nicaragua, and most of it comes from having a number of friends from there. But I know that the main players that I've heard of are the Sandinista National Liberation Front and the president, Daniel Ortega. Could you describe the conditions in your home country that forced you to leave?
In all honesty, Lorenzo, I chose to leave the country because I fear for my life. This was due to refusing to go along with orders that go against my values and principles. In Nicaragua, there is a complete destruction and dismantling of democracy currently going on at the hands of the Sandinistas. Sandinismo has existed in my country since 1979 and continues currently to this day through its current president, Daniel Ortega. I'd like to state something directly to the people of Buffalo, to the Catholic Christian people of Buffalo. In the last year, there have been more than 60 clergymen, including deacons, nuns, seminarians that have been expelled by the government of Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo. More than 30 clergymen have been exiled by the order of the Pope in order to protect their lives. Ortega has robbed over 16 clergymen of their citizenship. He has shut down religious newspapers, radio, and television stations. He expelled the papal envoy to Nicaragua, as well as 18 nuns from Mother Teresa's Missionaries of Charity from the country. This was solely against the Catholic Church. He froze church bank accounts, seized their property, and if that wasn't enough, I'd like to report to everyone listening that the Bishop of the Matagalpa, a pastor of 56 years, Rolando Jose Alvarez, still remains under police custody since August 22, 2022. He refused to be extradited and lost his citizenship, and due to that, he was charged with conspiracy and treason against the state. A man who has only served his country throughout his life. They have him in isolation.
I've pulled it up here. I'm looking at it right now. It's a sentence of 26 years.
A 26-year prison sentence. It's something unheard of. This is what I need to convey to the people of Buffalo, to the Catholic community. You have to understand that in Nicaragua, there's been a destabilization of the political, economic, and religious spheres. The living situation in the country is unsustainable. A high colonel in the Nicaraguan government, Oscar Mojica, said there are 3 options available to the dissenters: exile, jail, or death. The government of Nicaragua is what forced us to leave our home. I believe at the beginning of this interview, I stated that I fear for my life because I failed to follow rules that run contrary to my own ethics. That's what's happening. Nicaragua doesn't have many options. It's death, jail, or exile.
I'd say that those are not the greatest of options. I'm speaking with Mr. Alberto. He and his wife left Nicaragua about 7 months ago, passing through Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico, and now find themselves here in the Western New York area after having been bussed over from New York City. But let's go back a little bit. We left off with you turning yourselves in at the border to ICE agents. Without going into too many of the details that might jeopardize your petition for asylum, what happened after that point in time?
I have to tell you, once we cross into the United States, you can notice immediately that the country is rich in sovereignty and liberty. It's palpable the moment you step foot in it.
You see the Border Patrol agents, but was there anything else that made you feel that certain way?
When you decide to leave your country, all you need to see is a piece of land where you can express yourself freely and can be free. And when you cross over into the United States, my body felt it. When we crossed over and the border agent asked me where I'm from, to which we responded, from Nicaragua, that agent knew all about the situation that's going on over there. I couldn't have been the only Nicaraguan national that he's encountered. And he was very knowledgeable about our plight, offered suggestions, water, a jacket. We started filling out all the necessary paperwork. I'd be lying to you if I said it was easy, but a brief stint at a detention facility paled in comparison to all that we had experienced up until that point. I at least felt the freedom to speak openly, something that I guarantee I wouldn't be able to do back in Nicaragua. If we were doing this interview back in my home country, I wouldn't have been able to finish this interview with you because they'd find me and lock me up before then. There are no civil liberties in Nicaragua. Meanwhile, here I'm in a program to seek asylum here and able to speak. That gives me a great deal of comfort and solace.
Is there any concern for the well being of your loved ones back in Nicaragua?
Regrettably, Lorenzo, we had to leave our family members that associated with us. We were faced with death threats and had to flee the country immediately. But we left everything behind. We left behind the things that are most precious to us. That family that we left behind, our children, have not been able to go to school because they have become victims to persecution. I can't take them to a public hospital or school. And if that wasn't enough, they're not even safe in my own home. I have to keep moving them from city to city in order to protect them. When I left my country, I didn't leave because of financial reasons. I left because of political persecution. But today, I'm now facing a monetary problem because our family that stayed behind depends on the money we send back to them. That's where we find ourselves today. We have to clear our immigration hurdles so that we can seek proper employment here and seek the safety we're looking for.
Is there any hope that you'll be able to see them again?
Truthfully, since I arrived and got into the asylum seeking process, I'm still lacking a lot of legal knowledge. As Nicaraguans, we receive what's called a TPS designation, or a temporary protected status designated country, which helps us remain protected and not get deported. But that's where we're at, Lorenzo. This part of our journey is just beginning, one that is long and slow moving.
The worst thing, the unfortunate thing here in this case, is that you're just merely starting this process after everything else you've been through. What you stated breaks my heart because, once again, I can't imagine how it is going through everything you've gone through. My only hope is that you're all able to reunite in some free land somewhere and get away from the turmoil in your home of Nicaragua.
The truth is, my wife and I, we've told our family that stay behind, if this glorious country that is the United States, a land of liberty and opportunities, denies me the chance to stay here, and specifically in Buffalo, I'll return to my country with my head held up high, and I shall die with dignity. That's what we will have to do.
My hope is, and I don't think it will, get to that end result. There's been a long-standing debate as to what should be done with the multitude of migrants coming into this country. And many who are critical of the process are the ones that might not be aware of the actual real-life experiences that those immigrants face. They see immigrants as a problem and not as human beings. That's why I think it's important, so important, to hear about your case and your story so that we can all understand the decisions that you made weren't made frivolously. The extreme conditions you faced and the risks you took were done so that you could reap the benefits and the liberties that at the moment are not available to you in your country.
That's correct.
You've told me that it's not only priests and clergymen that are facing threats and prison sentences. What else can you tell me about the state of the economy and the political landscape of Nicaragua? For those listening, what else can you tell them about the Sandinista Party and Daniel Ortega, a president who, to my understanding, has abolished term limits and has been serving as president of Nicaragua since 2007?
That's correct. He can be elected as many times as he chooses to run.
The term limits were thrown out in 2014, but he's been in power since 2007, correct?
Yes, and if you go further in history, you will find that Daniel Ortega has been in power since 1979. Since 1979, he's been the same president. And yes, there have been 2 or 3 other presidents in Nicaragua throughout that span of time, but he's been pulling the strings. I'd also like to clarify to the listening audience that this cancer has been around Nicaraguan politics since the 1980s. The confiscation and seizure of land has been a tactic employed by the Sandinista front for many years. Lorenzo, my grandfather, my father, myself, and if nothing is done, my children, 4 generations have been fighting the disease that is the Sandinista National Liberation Front. To give you an example, in the last presidential elections, Ortega captured, incarcerated, condemned, and deported 7 of the presidential candidates in Nicaragua. I can list them for you. Cristina Chamorro, the strongest candidate we've had, Arturo Cruz, Felix Maradiaga, Juan Sebastian Chamorro, Miguel Mora, a journalist whose news outlet was seized by the government, Merdardo Mairena, Noel Vidaurre. This is not only a Nicaraguan problem, this is a global problem. Look, El Inmueble, the building that was the United States Embassy, was expropriated, seized by the Nicaraguan government, and the staff was expelled from the country. They took over La Prensa, Nicaragua's longest-running and most iconic newspaper. He confiscated 100% Noticias, 100% News, the aforementioned Miguel Mora's news channel that was one of the ardent critics of the government. All the opposing media radio stations disappeared, many of them as a result of a fire. They took control of many of the means of private communication. They have practically left us no choice. Over 150,000 Nicaraguans have fled the country trying to save our lives. And as I mentioned before, if I get sent back, I will keep on fighting this system.
Everyone must.
These are just some of the facts.
Dissidents also accuse him of spreading misinformation. Since 2021, the human rights collective known as Nicaragua Nunca Más, or Nevermore Nicaragua, have been forced into exile. It's a lengthy list of injustices. I don't know if you've been up to date on the news out of the country, but Ortega recently met with the president of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi. Raisi conducted a diplomatic trip to Nicaragua, to Cuba, and Venezuela, countries that are directly opposed to the United States. What can you tell us about how the Nicaraguan government views the United States?
It's no secret, Lorenzo. Nicaragua's government, or rather Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo, Ortega's wife and vice president, have always used disparaging language when it comes to, in their words, the meddlesome Yankee Empire. But Daniel Ortega came into power much like Hugo Chavez, Venezuela, Evo Morales, Bolivia, like many others. In Cuba, Daniel Ortega spent time with guerrilla forces and side by side with the Castro regime. And while there, he became a thief, a murderer, and learned all the tactics that he would eventually use to assume and retain power in Nicaragua.
The web of influence that Cuba is a part of is astounding. And like you said, it's no secret that Iran harbors some resentment to the United States, not to mention their own human rights violations and the like.
Russia and China have also allied themselves with Nicaragua. From what I have been told, Nicaragua is housing Russian armaments within their borders. It's to be investigated further, but I'm sure that's not to protect Nicaraguans.
Another global issue was the COVID pandemic. How was that handled in Nicaragua?
Lamentably, despite the many deaths in my country, it was not seen as this worldwide pandemic. Businesses remained open, as well as recreation centers. The government made no attempt to help its citizens with food or masks or anything. In fact, they raised taxes during this time. Truthfully, the Nicaraguan government did nothing to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. It was business as usual, and the disease was debunked and denied. Students still attended classes. We didn't address the pandemic like the rest of the world seems to have done.
Are there any opposition movements fighting the injustices in Nicaragua? Is there any hope for change from within?
The hope lies with those that are in exile, those that were able to escape, because the country has been shrouded in silence and fear. I wasn't able to mention this earlier, but I'd like the people of Buffalo to understand my personal circumstances. I can tell you, I worked at the Dr. Alejandro de Vida Bolaños Military Hospital in the capital city of Managua. Since 2018, we would receive direct orders that we were not to treat any dissidents or opposition members in our hospital. Many of us defied those orders that were handed down by the country's Ministry of Health, orders that were given as well by the Workers' Front. Once we went against those orders, we each began to experience direct persecution. Also, these were orders that were given throughout the country, not just where I was. And because of that, we saw many more deaths than there should have been. I dare to tell the story of Alvaro Conrado, a young boy in Nicaragua, a martyr. His only crime in the eyes of the Nicaraguan government was providing water to opposition group members, and he was assassinated by a government sharpshooter. He uttered a phrase, one that shakes up most Nicaraguans when they hear it. It hurts to breathe. For us in Nicaragua, it hurts to breathe. We are being asphyxiated by the group in power, and we are unfortunately not receiving the international attention or help that we should be getting. We need help to expel the corrupt government in Nicaragua. It would be very remiss of me not to have mentioned Alvaro Conrado, because it hurts to breathe. All of us that are in exile are the hope for an entire country.
It's a truly tragic story, Albert. How old was Alvaro?
He was no older than 15, maybe 13 or 14. He was just a child. And he wasn't the youngest child that was killed by snipers. A 3-year-old. Just to send a message to his father, they murdered his young child. All this has been reported and documented, Lorenzo.
I'd like to give you a moment to send a message to our audience. What words do you have for the people of Buffalo and Western New York in regards to all the immigrants that are ending up in this area?
People of Buffalo, we have left our homes not by choice. We haven't come to this country seeking the American dream. We have come here merely attempting to survive. I'd also like to say that I don't want to be a burden to this government. I want government officials, I want people to know that we want to be able to contribute to this country. We want to follow the laws and we want to obtain the necessary documents so that we can work and pay taxes. We're hoping to obtain an identification card and all the necessary requirements in order to rent property and live a life here. I want a job so that I could buy a vehicle and have the ability to dream about rescuing and reuniting with our daughters. We want to embed ourselves into society, but we don't want to be a burden to the state. I wasn't one in my home country, and I intend to not be one here. I merely want my ability to work and pay taxes here. We want our independence.
It's the only thing we can offer in this country. Alberto, I can't express enough my gratitude to you and your wife for the time and for sharing your story with us. You mentioned your family. Have you been able to speak to your family since you've been here?
Yes, we've been able to have some communication. A little unstable, but yes.
Would you like to send a message to your country or to your loved ones back home?
To Nicaragua, we keep on fighting. We keep on fighting until this murderous regime is done and over with. It's a government that, by United States' own account, has been labeled a human rights offender. It's a government where everyone already knows what they are doing. To the government, wherever there's a Nicaraguan national in the world, the battle against your oppression will continue. Like I said at one point of this conversation, if it doesn't happen for us here in this country, we'll return and continue to fight back in our home country with honor and pride. To die with dignity, because we can't return to our country in its current state. But once again, to that government, we will continue to fight.
A quick question. Have you been able to get out and see the surrounding neighborhoods? Is there any way that we could help the group of refugees that are out here now?
I'm speaking for the group at large. We're the only Nicaraguans here, but in general, the conditions are fairly well. We're being taken care of with necessities. But really, the most important thing would be help securing working papers. We're speaking with some of the legal aides here, but the average Nicaraguan is a hard worker. My dream is to become independent, be able to provide for my family, and hopefully be financially able to bring the rest of my family here.
Alberto, the rest of the refugees that are there with you, where are they from and what are the kinds of stories that you're hearing?
There are not a lot of us Latinos here, but you're seeing a lot of people from Haiti, West Africa, I think perhaps Nigeria, but not a lot of us Latinos, maybe 10 in total.
Is there a good sense of community between everybody?
Yes, the stories are all a bit different, but the reasons are quite the same. Security in their home countries and governments that are not taking care of their own.
Once again, my gratitude to you for sharing this and much good fortune to you, your wife, and may the cries for help be heard. May Nicaragua see far better days.
Thanks to you, Lorenzo, for the opportunity. Many thanks to the welcoming people of Buffalo and the many organizations that have helped us along the way. In all honesty, thanks to the United States for allowing me to plead my case. We're very grateful to all, and hopefully, if the good Lord Christ allows it, after some time to set up here, I promise all of Buffalo that you'll see the finest Nicaraguan restaurant you've ever seen.
Hey, now we're talking. Some carne asada, manuelitas.
The renowned Gallo Pinto.
Alberto, I haven't had lunch yet. Please do not do this. Shortly after the second and third waves of buses that arrived in Cheektowaga, Catherine Grange, the Director of Advocacy for Jericho Road Community Health Center, and one of the people helping to process these new arrivals, gave us an idea of the many stories that she encountered.
Yeah, so I was called to be from my bosses at Jericho Road, asked to be in the hotel the day after buses arrive and to do sort of an intake. I specifically was asked because I do speak Spanish and I can communicate with probably 50% of the folks who have come over. And so I sort of sit down with them one by one. I have this intake form that just asks the most basic questions. Where are you coming from? Who are you traveling with? Any medical issues? Any other social needs? And of course, assuming legal needs. And then just answering some of their questions that they have about the coming days. But I've had the opportunity to sort of get to know these folks and to hear, like you said, to hear parts of their stories. I mean, I don't think anyone would leave their children, their families behind unless they had to, unless death was knocking at their door. And so to know that and then to repeatedly have that confirmed from the stories that we're hearing is really humbling and sobering. I spoke to a gentleman who pulled up a picture on his phone of a notice that he received at his very small business. I think he fixed cell phones. And the notice sort of said, it had the logo of a local cartel and said, unless you pay this certain amount, we promise you that you will have problems and that those problems will be violence and death or deadly violence. And like, if you can't pay, make yourself available to us so that we can ensure that those things happen to you, basically. And that, folks, a lot of times what we're hearing is they'll sort of be chased out of the specific town that they're in, and they'll try other towns, they'll try other jurisdictions, they'll try the police, they'll try everything they can to not have to leave their country and their family behind. But when that is not sufficient, when you still don't have protection after trying all those things, your next option is to leave. And that's what we're seeing. So you can sort of follow the conflicts and human rights crises across the country and then watch them come to Buffalo. As far as what folks can do to assist, you can follow us on our social media. We are frequently sort of tweeting out other organizations that we're working with who are collecting donations. We're still trying to figure out exactly what .go is responsible for and what we're responsible for. Everything is sort of, taking it as it comes, but we will have information on our social media accounts and on our website. And then more largely speaking, if our state could pass, there's currently a bill being considered about access to representation. As many folks know, if you are charged with a crime in the United States and you don't have money for an attorney, you're given a public defender, a criminal defense attorney. That is provided for you free of cost. But in these hearings where it is truly death penalty, it's life or death in these asylum cases. If you lose your asylum case and then you're sent back to that country, you very likely could get killed or will get killed. And so, folks, these high stakes hearings, and people are not given an attorney and they're not allowed to work until they have work authorization. And so how are they supposed to provide for themselves and provide an attorney for themselves? And so we need legislation that would permit free attorneys for people who fall within the economic status for a free attorney in immigration court. We also need better language access. There's also bills about language access. At Jericho Road, we provide in-person language access, which most organizations do not do, but we have seen how beneficial that is when you are speaking to someone who is from your country, from your culture, and can really help to translate the context of what is being told to you, and maybe even connect with you in a community level. So we need more organizations stepping up to pay for that type of interpretation, and then just better language access in general. And then legal services. The thing that I am repeatedly hearing, and sort of what was promised to folks, is that in Buffalo, you will have better access to language, or you'll have better access to legal services, and we certainly hope that that is true. We're working hard to make sure that that is true, but we need our Journey's End Volunteer Lawyers Project, we need them to be able to have time to train and to hire attorneys who can take these cases, and funds to do that. That is going to make a world of difference for these folks. The quicker you apply for asylum, the quicker you can get work access or work authorization. The quicker you can get work authorization, the quicker you can provide for your family, pay for your own apartment, and sort of move on without, needing to rely on other services.
While the influx of migrants from New York City has stopped since the middle of August due to 2 sex crimes that occurred in the hotels housing the migrants, a number of developments have led to even more questions about the status of said migrants in our state and our immediate area. New York City Comptroller Brad Lander has questioned the emergency contract the city has made with medical services company DocGo. DocGo was tasked with the logistics and welfare of the current migrants in the greater Buffalo area, as well as New York City. With that $432 million contract in question, and with Lander threatening to revoke the deal, many wonder where the money will come from to continue to prevent a humanitarian crisis from occurring here in Western New York. Asylum seekers are not eligible for Social Security benefits, but according to Erie County officials, they are entitled to health checkups and vaccinations through state and federal grants. The discussion continues as to how the area will cover education and costs not covered by other governmental entities. The one bright spot for some of the immigrants here and throughout the state that came from Venezuela, President Biden announced a change in policy that will grant the coveted temporary protected status to those originating from Venezuela. This would temporarily halt deportations for that group, as well as allow them to apply for 30-day-at-a-time work permits. Other asylum seekers seeking work authorization still need to wait 5 months after submitting an application for asylum. We here at WBFO and on What's Next hope to continue to cover this developing issue in our region. In the meantime, we'd like to thank you for having listened to this episode of Producers Picks. What's Next airs each weekday morning at 10 a.m. and re-airs each weeknight at 9 p.m. You can also catch episodes on demand at WBFO.org and wherever you get your podcasts. For Buffalo Toronto Public Media, I'm Lorenzo Rodriguez. Thank you for listening.